The Chicago Bears need Gervon Dexter to step up into a bigger role on this defensive line this year, and the same is true for Velus Jones on special teams. So we'll take a look at some of the other younger Bears players who are going to have higher expectations in 2024.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast at Locked On Bears on all of your favorite social media platforms, including the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. On the show today, we will hear from Chicago Bears defensive coordinator Eric Washington about what the expectations are for Gervon Dexter and how the coaching staff is going through that with him this offseason to have him prepared for what should be a bigger role in his second season. Then we'll hear from special teams coordinator Richard Hightower about how the new kickoff rules in the NFL will create more opportunities for someone like Velus Jones, who he's particularly excited about stepping into a bigger role there this season. We'll use that to springboard and look at a couple other players who need to step up and be more for the Bears this season or risk losing their job this year or certainly in the very near future. But I want to start at the defensive line because that remains perhaps the biggest need across the board on this Bears team. You could probably use more at both defensive end and defensive tackle if we're being honest with you, but as things stand today, Gervon Dexter is penciled in as your starting three-technique defensive tackle. And that's a big step up for a guy who they were kind of rebuilding from the ground up last year for asking him to do a lot of different things on the defensive line in Chicago than what he was asked to do at Florida. But he's also a second-round pick, a top 50 draft pick, or maybe it's 51, but you know what I mean, essentially a top 50 draft pick who you expect a player taken that early is going to have to play a starter-like role relatively early in their career. So it's kind of go time for Gervon Dexter. So here's the Bears defensive coordinator, the new defensive coordinator, Eric Washington, laying out what the plan is for Dexter right now and how this team is going about it at this stage of the offseason.
Eric, as you guys are moving into phase two, what benchmarks do you want Gervon and Zach to hit as they get into the OTAs period and then go and like setting them up for training camp?
I want to see polished fundamentals. I want to see things that I know will allow them to be as disruptive and as efficient with their rush fundamentals as possible. We're talking about footwork, alignment adjustments based on the down and distance. And when we're in an obvious passing situation, it's more awareness and just a great coordination of fundamentals that I know that are going to give them a chance to really win that particular rep and down.
Is Gervon ready for full-time? I feel like if that's his spot at three technique with Justin gone, is he ready for a full-time role there?
Well, our responsibility is to make sure he is when it counts. And that's why we're going to use the full process, the off-season training camp, every ounce of meeting that we can get walkthroughs to just continue to move him forward.
We're still in what they call, phase two of the offseason program. So he's not going to have a bunch of specific things for Gervon Dexter to do right now because they're not, practicing against teammates. They're not putting pads on and going full contact. So it is going to be a lot more fundamentals, foundational technique stuff to make sure that he's got the awareness and that on every snap he knows what his responsibilities are and what the offense is going to be trying to do to stop him and how he can be effective in doing so. So I certainly think that's exactly the kind of path you're looking up for someone like Gervon Dexter, who's still young and relatively raw at the position that you're trying to develop into something greater. But the follow-up question there about, is Dexter ready for this? I don't want to be reading too much between the lines here or trying to raise concerns that aren't there or whatever, but that wasn't as ringing of an endorsement of Dexter as I maybe would have thought, right? It's like, hey, is he ready for this? Usually I would think a coach would come out and say, oh yeah, 100%. we trust him. We have our full faith in him, and we're gonna make him, the absolute best player he could be, and he's gonna be a great player for us, etc. And with Eric Washington, it was like, hey, Eric, is he ready for this big time role? And it's like, we're gonna make sure that he is, like, right? Like, that doesn't sound quite the same as like a super, super strong, straightforward vote of confidence. And that's where I still wonder if some kind of defensive line addition might still be in the works. So they're going to go through OTAs and mini camp this part of the offseason and really get a sense for, okay, how much progress is Gervon Dexter making? And Zach Pickens as well, not to ignore him in this conversation. But Dexter's projected to start at 3 technique and Pickens to probably be the backup nose tackle. But they'll get a good sense through this next month-ish before they really go away for the offseason break before training camp, and they can get through that process and say either, all right, Dexter's looking good, he's on track, he's learning all the things and has the fundamentals of the technique that Eric Washington was talking about, so like we're really confident in him coming to training camp and being that starting caliber defensive tackle, or they get through this process and say, it takes a while for young defensive linemen to really hit their stride in the NFL. It takes a couple of seasons for a lot of young defensive tackles, especially, even if they're not as raw as Gervon Dexter. It's just a slow transition position in the NFL. And maybe they'll get through this process and say, yeah, maybe we should put a higher priority on adding something else at that position. Because the other thing is they don't have a ton of experienced depth at defensive tackle. They've added now a couple of undrafted rookie free agents in there. Keith Randolph from Illinois, and then they added Deshaun Mallory after rookie minicamp. But like they don't have proven experience there. Like they signed Byron Cowart, who I think has played for the Patriots and a few other teams, and he's played some nose tackle and some 3 technique. I don't know where he's going to end up lining up for them, but they also signed Michael Dumafour, who's another sort of like rotational backup 3 technique guy who's been around the NFL a little bit before, and then it's Zach Pickens, and like that's all of your defensive tackle depth right now. So I find myself feeling like even if Gervon Dexter is everything they want him to be, and he takes this big step forward this offseason and is looking like a starting caliber defensive tackle, I would still like to add a veteran defensive tackle, right? It's hard for me to envision a scenario where I feel so great about my defensive tackle depth with all of those names there that you probably haven't heard of other than maybe seeing it on a flyer that the Bears signed them, but like not a player you had heard of before this season or knew they existed before the Chicago Bears signed them, right? Like that to me is usually a pretty good sign of like, hey, maybe they could use some kind of somebody there, even if it's not a huge upgrade guaranteed week 1 starter, but just like another veteran with a little bit more experience there. Because it feels like right now it's Dexter Billings, Zach Pickens, Byron Cowart are kind of your top 4. And then, maybe one of the undrafted free agent guys sticks on. But even then, like a DeMarcus Walker can rotate in some defensive tackle. But I don't feel good about that defensive tackle depth as it stands right now, regardless of the kind of progress Gervon Dexter makes. And especially if he doesn't make the kind of progress they want him to, then absolutely I need to find somebody in some way to add some defensive tackle talent here. And maybe that even comes at 53-man roster cut downs and you pick up somebody who was released from another roster before week 1. Like it's not ideal, but the Bears can't do everything all at once in one offseason and get, everything fixed every year. So we'll keep close tabs on how Gervon Dexter's progress goes. We'll also be keeping a close eye on some of the other recent draft picks that need to take some more steps forward, make that progress this offseason, including Velus Jones, who even as a 3rd-round pick just a couple of seasons ago, I certainly don't think he's guaranteed a spot on this 53-man roster, but it helps that he has a strong endorsement from his special teams coordinator, who we'll hear from next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at Gametime, the best way to get tickets for all of your favorite live events, especially with the Bears' schedule coming out this week. Tickets will start going on sale, and you can snatch them up at Gametime because Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. They've got last-minute deals, so you're going to get great prices to go to Bears games, comedy shows, concerts, theater, pretty much any live event. But you can also see your view from your seat, so you know exactly what you're getting when you arrive, and you're not going to be surprised with an obstructed view or just being farther away than you thought you would based on you looking at the little ticket diagram. I also love their all-in pricing, so there are no surprise fees or costs at the end that make the tickets more expensive than you thought they were going to be when you started to go through the checkout process. So that's why I cannot endorse the Gametime app enough, because I use it all the time to buy my concert tickets. I went to 2 Bears games through the Gametime app last year as well. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem our code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download the Gametime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Expectations are pretty low for someone like Velus Jones entering training camp this season. Definitely a forgotten man at wide receiver and hasn't given us a ton of reason to be super confident in his ability to, at the really, not even contribute on offense, but contribute on special teams on this roster. It was not something that we were super confident. They alternated some different people at the kick return position the last couple of seasons. He seemed to kind of settle into a role there, but it still hasn't lived up to quite the third round expectations. But now the kickoff rules are different. And that should, in theory, it's designed to promote more kickoff returns while also trying to make those kickoff returns more safe for everyone involved. And the style of kickoff returns that they create for, in theory, should be beneficial to someone like Velus Jones. I'm not certain that there's a ton of specific characteristics that makes it better for Velus Jones than any other returner, but I think the Bears special teams coordinator Richard Hightower did a pretty good job of trying to lay that out and make the case for this being big for Jones and his ability to be like a legitimate contributor this year on special teams.
How will the new rule benefit your guys specifically? Is there anybody that you have in mind that's going to really benefit from this new rule?
Yeah, that's a great question, Larry. When you talk about the new rules and what is the purpose and what is the emphasis of the new rules is to bring more returns into the game. So how it pertains to our team, you can only think about a guy like Velus Jones. It's a great example. It was his birthday today too, so happy birthday for him. But a guy like that with his type of skill set, with the speed and the power that he has, and he's coming full speed ahead at you, it's like a damn freight train running at you. And he's going to get an opportunity to touch the ball, 3 or 4 more times a game. And we all know he's a very dynamic player with the ball in his hand. But this new rule, because of the landing zone, because of the league incentivizing returns, it's only going to have a really good effect for not only our whole return team, but for a guy like that to really change the game.
So someone like Velus Jones certainly has the size and the speed and the strength to be an effective dynamic returner and someone who can scare the opposing kicking team when the ball is in his hands. Like that's a big part of why the Bears drafted him in the third round. That the problem has been, realizing that, having that actually come into fruition instead of, last year he had 16 kickoff returns. He had a decent average on those, but he touched the ball 16 times on kickoffs, 8 carries on offense, and 4 catches on offense. So quick math says 12 plus 16 is 28 times he touched the ball in 14 games. That's 2 touches per game, right? That's not the kind of impact we've wanted from a third round pick with definite real athletic tools, even though he's, on the older side, just turned 27 as Richard Hightower wished him a happy birthday there. So that's where it's like, okay, maybe this new kickoff return rules that promotes more returns on kickoffs will mean more opportunities for him to actually have the ball in his hands and an opportunity to make plays on the kickoff team to justify a little bit more of that value. Because even last year, his longest return was 37 yards. He might have had a longer one called back by a penalty, but the longest one on his stat sheet was 37 yards. He had a longer one his rookie year as well that went for 63 yards as well. But okay, so he's going to be able to touch the ball, I guess it depends on how many times you give up points on the other end, right? Because that's the only time teams are going to kick off is once at the beginning of the game or the half, and then every time they score. And if this Bears defense plays well, maybe the other team's only kicking off 1 or 2 or 3 times a game, depending on how good the opponent is. But at the very least, it is more opportunities for him, and that will be valuable. If you're not familiar with exactly how the new kickoff rules are going to work, certainly I'm not going to sit here and read every single aspect of it. But the main gist you need to know for someone like Velus Jones is you now have this like designated landing zone. So like essentially the coverage team and the return team, as far as the blockers and the coverage guys, the non-kickers and the non-returners all line up about 10 yards from each other at around between like the 45 and the 30-yard line by the kick returner. And then like the kicks need to land in the landing zone of the 20-yard line or farther back. And so the return men start, you can have one or two people in the landing zone, that's it, but it'll probably just be one, or I guess second might be a blocker back there. You're going to have teams trying to land it in the landing zone because touchbacks go back to the 30-yard line now, which will be even more a reason to not want to have balls go that way. Out of bounds still, I think it's the 40-yard line now. But teams are going to be trying to land it in that landing zone and set up a return there and try and tackle him short of the 30-yard line to make it less than a touchback there. And because your blockers are closer to the coverage unit, they both start out really close to each other, that might mean more time that they have to sustain some of those blocks for the returner to have to get around. But at the same time, it's a quicker decision then for him because, okay, you're not reading the long field. It's closer to what a punt return might feel like in the sense of like the contact is right there as opposed to in the past, kickoff is kind of, you get 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 yards before you really start have to make your first cut or make your first move. But now everything is condensed and a little bit closer in front of you. So, if you can make that one or two guys miss, there's not that like trailing back end to still corral you and chase you down because everyone is so much closer to you. You don't have that. The kicker will still be back there, but there's no one else back there by the kicker. But it's going to be a new strategy game too for special teams coaches who say, okay, maybe do we need to have a couple of guys stay back just in case? But then you have an outsized number of blockers versus coverage guys. If you have any of your coverage guys kind of dropping back to make sure you don't give up a big return, so then you've got extra blockers to try and make some double teams and set up some blocking windows for guys. So I think every special teams coordinator right now is trying to come up with ways to like creatively draw up both their kickoff coverage and kickoff return schemes to put someone like Velus Jones, at least on the return end, in a better position to free up long returns. And certainly on the other end, like they're trying to scheme up things to maybe bait the returner to go a certain direction where guys will be able to converge on him and try and limit the length of those returns. And I think there's going to be a lot of like throwing stuff at the wall, trial and error things here. Well, coaches will come with some ideas and some of them will work and some of them won't. And I'm really curious to see if it helps, like if this season separates a little bit like the difference between a really good special teams coach and maybe a less great special teams coach, right? I think we know Dave Tobe has been a good special teams coach for a long time and was in the past able to scheme up big returns and help guys like Hester and Manning and Knox and others have big returns in Chicago. But like, I feel like most other special teams coordinators, you can tell if they're really bad. Like the Packers had that for a little while there, but like, feels like vast majority of the special teams coordinators we all think are like, they're fine. Like they're all right. Like, you know how good of a special teams coordinator the Bears have? Richard Hightower? Like, I don't know. He seems fine. Like the Bears aren't constantly having blocked punts or making big mistakes or, missed field goals and stuff. Like they generally seem to have a reliable special teams unit, but like, is he a top 10 special teams coach? I don't know how would we be able to tell, right? But maybe now when coaches will have some scheme ability of like where exactly you line guys up and how you have them move after the snap. Like I think there's more different dynamics here that the more creative and innovative special teams coaches can maybe separate themselves a little bit. And if the Bears can spring a few big returns free, then that could be great. And it might not always be just Velus Jones, right? He still has to win the competition as the kickoff return guy. We've seen Rome Odunze do some punt returns, a couple of them at Washington. I don't know if he did kickoffs a couple as well, but like he has some return ability. And there's also someone like Khalil Herbert, who's no longer the number one running back. So maybe that means more opportunity for him on special teams if DeAndre Swift is still going to be kind of the lead back there. And I really do think, even including and beyond special teams, Herbert's another player who's got to step up in 2024, who I think has a lot on the line here that the Bears will need to see more from him this season, or the rest of the NFL will too, because he's entering free agency next offseason. So we'll look at Herbert and a couple other Bears players that we want to see more from this season next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel Sportsbook, America's #1 sportsbook. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Because right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. So you bet $5 on any of these playoff games. Major League Baseball season's underway. There's plenty of prop bets as well for football year-round. And if your $5 bet wins, you, of course, get the winnings for that $5 bet. And then FanDuel will add another extra $150 into your account to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. They've got line right now on Caleb Williams' rookie season passing yards, Rome Odunze's rookie season receiving yards. And as the schedule comes out, they will have lines for Bears games and whatever they have week 1. That line will be out quickly at FanDuel. So to claim your $150 in bonus bets, visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Velus Jones and Gervon Dexter were singled out by their coaching staff this week. And part of it's just the media asking the question too, right? It's not always the coach choosing who to single out, but being asked about specific players. But like those players were in focus this week as guys with a lot at stake and a lot of progress that needs to be made from both of them. But they're certainly not the only Bears that deserve some of our attention here this offseason. We just were starting to talk about someone like Khalil Herbert, who I am a big fan of. To me, it's not so much that like Herbert needs to prove that he's what he's capable of to me, but he's entering the last year of his contract. And the Bears clearly have kind of said, listen, we like you, Khalil Herbert, but it's not going to stop us from signing DeAndre Swift in free agency. We're going to go out and sign a 1,000-yard back because, you haven't been that for us. I think Khalil Herbert has been very good. I think Khalil Herbert is a very good NFL running back. And I believe Khalil Herbert is capable of being a #1 running back. But you compare 2023, this past season, to the year before, 2022, and his production was down a little bit. Lower total yards, lower yards per carry, lower yards per game. Also, despite having more carries per game this past season, he did improve as a receiver in terms of the production, but like Khalil Herbert was on this like upward trend. And then, last year, I think it's better to say it plateaued. It didn't like he took a big step backwards, but like didn't have that I'm clearly the dominant lead back type of performance. And honestly, I think one of the biggest parts of that has just been his inability to stay consistently healthy over the course of a full season. Because this past season, it was about 4 or 5 games in, he hurts the ankle and ends up on the short-term injured reserve and misses, I don't remember what it was, 4 or 5 or 6 games, whatever the exact number was. And then you might remember a couple years ago, later in the season, a short-term stint on injured reserve. And it's like, he feels like he's getting close to some of these big plays, and then it just doesn't quite all happen. I still think he's a very good running back and is a guy who I would have trusted in that #1 role, but the Bears sent a message otherwise. And now he's entering the last year of his rookie contract, and he's clearly going to be the #2 this year. So he's got to show the Bears and every other team that might be interested in signing him, they're like, hey, I'm more than this. I can do more than that. And I think part of that's going to be, if he's in this backup type role with Roschon Johnson in a rotation, right, I don't think he's going to get a crazy amount of carries. Like, he's not going to get no carries, but like he's got to also be able to do more than just be a ball carrier. If you're not the #1 back on the depth chart, then more of your opportunities are going to come in the passing game as a receiver and as a blocker out of the backfield. And you also need to contribute more on special teams, where again, like he didn't do any kickoffs at all last season because he was kind of the top running back. And they also wanted to get Velus Jones more involved, et cetera. But we saw early in his Bears career, he had some really dynamic returns because he's a dynamic athlete. And so I'd like to see Khalil Herbert do more, not in terms of proving how good of a runner he is, because I've seen him be explosive, dynamic, make big plays as a ball carrier, getting handoffs out of the backfield. But like if he wants to be able to cash in free agency and get a bigger role somewhere else than just being DeAndre Swift's backup, we need a little more as a receiver. We definitely need more as a blocker. And at 5'9", 210 odd pounds, whatever it is, like there are some limitations there, but I think he's capable of doing more. And I want to see Khalil Herbert do more this season with less of the lead back dynamic pressure on his shoulders there. And also, hey, you got to keep that young kid Roschon Johnson from taking your job too, because it feels to me like if I had to predict right now, they'll let Khalil Herbert walk in free agency and go into next year with Swift and Roschon Johnson as the number 2 and feel like that's a fine duo and you don't need Khalil Herbert. So Khalil, go out there and show them that they need you or that some team should need you because you're going to be a very valuable piece of their backfield. A couple other Bears I want to keep tabs on here. It's like we need to see better from Nate Davis. Last year was a pretty big disappointment from him. Touted as what was supposed to be a real stabilizing force in free agency, coming at right guard, lock that spot down, be that veteran to pair next to Darnell Wright, who they went and drafted afterward. Like that felt like, okay, you're supposed to be able to feel really good about that right side. But then earlier in the season, dealt with some personal issues, family issues, whatever was going on in his life that certainly outside of his control. I don't blame him for it. I don't look down on him for it or whatever, but like was affecting his level of play and also missed games as a result of that. Comes back and is maybe getting into the swing of things a little bit and then hurts his ankle, misses 4 or 5 games from that. And then for the rest of the season, I don't know, never quite felt like he was 100% ready to go. But we've seen him be a much better player in previous years in Tennessee than he was this past season in Chicago. So I think there's reason to be optimistic that Nate Davis can get back to a certain level of consistency. I don't think he's going to become a Pro Bowl player all of a sudden. He was not that in Tennessee, but he was reliable, and I'm certainly more reliable there than he was here last season. And I think there's reason to expect or hope or, predict that he'll be closer to his previous expected level of ability and production than the pretty significant disappointment that he presented last season. So I'm hoping to be able to see more from Nate Davis this season and get back to more of that to provide some more stability up front for Caleb Williams, especially with new center. It's really going to be a center competition throughout training camp. So to really make sure that all 4 of those other spots are locked in becomes that much more important when you have it will initially start out as instability at center and hopefully materialize with one player holding down that spot for all 17 games. Not realistic. Every offensive lineman will deal with injuries at some point. So you got to be ready for it with depth. But if Nate Davis can be a little bit more available and reliable and consistent this season, that would go a long way for this Bears offensive line. And the last guy who is definitely on the roster block here, but also has an opportunity for himself and can really kind of have a wide range of outcomes is Dominic Robinson at defensive end. We knew coming in, raw prospect, converted wide receiver who I think had played quarterback, if I remember right, coming out like a little bit of QB going into college, played some wide receiver in college, switched to defensive end, bulked up. Like we kind of knew that this was not going to be a guy who stepped in and was great right away. Had a couple flashes as a rookie, got pretty significant playing time, all things considered. Last year, falls off the map, especially after the Montez Sweat trade. I don't know if you could call that the doghouse. I don't know if he did anything wrong, but just really wasn't getting playing time down the stretch. Was not a guy who was much a part of this defensive end rotation as is. And I don't recall there being any sort of publicly reported injury. He wasn't on the injury report. Maybe he was dealing with nagging stuff, but was not listed as out with injury. It was inactive coach's decision type situation for him. But he's got an opportunity in front of him, and you feel like there's still more potential there. He's a 5th-round pick, so we're not expecting him to become a 10-sack guy, but it feels like we haven't seen the best of Dominic Robinson yet. And when you look at this defensive end depth chart, all the opportunities in front of him, Sweat and DeMarcus Walker are your starters right now, and then it's a competition for the number 3 spot between Dominic Robinson and Austin Booker, the rookie 5th-round pick this year. Plus, they signed Jake Martin as a free agent and brought back Khalid Kareem. Any of those 4 backups could be the number 3 pass rusher. Dominic Robinson could easily, well, I don't know if I say easily, but could realistically and reasonably win that number 3 defensive end role because he's been here the longest and has been working with these coaches the longest and can kind of plug into some of that experience here to be that guy and step up into that role. But he wasn't able to take that step forward last season. But like we talked about with Dexter, defensive linemen in general, adjusting to the NFL is one of those positions. D-line and tight end are 2 of the slowest to adjust to the NFL and really fulfill your potential because of the physicality and the combination of the speed and sort of run and pass responsibilities. There's a lot on those players' plates in particular that make that tough to adjust to in addition to the physicality. So I haven't given up faith in Dominic Robinson, but he's a guy who could go anywhere from being their number 3 rusher and take a big step forward to miss the 53-man roster entirely because they stick with Jake Martin and Austin Booker, and maybe they sign another defensive end at some point, and Robinson's gone after 2 full seasons in Chicago. Like, he could really swing completely either way, and I'm hoping that the defensive line coach Travis Smith and now the new defensive coordinator Eric Washington with defensive line coaching experience, if they can just squeeze a little bit more of Dominic Robinson and get him closer to the player that he has rare athletic tools. You just got to really be able to put it all together. So the Bears counting on a lot of young players on their defensive line right now. We'll keep close tabs on their progress throughout the offseason. And certainly, if the Bears bring in a bigger named veteran, you can be sure we'll break it all down for you right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, because that's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. If you're looking for your second listen today, I filled in as co-host on the Locked On NFL podcast, looking at the NFL from the league-wide perspective. Alongside Ross Jackson, we talked about the Chiefs-Ravens being the first game of the season announced and what kind of goes into that rivalry and how exciting of a game 1 of the season that's going to be. And we also looked at some of the other non-division rivalries like Chiefs and Ravens around the NFL that are exciting and add something more to games, and including making fun of the Green Bay Packers. So if you want to hear making fun of the Green Bay Packers, go check out Locked On NFL wherever you get your podcast and on YouTube. Then come on back tomorrow for another episode of Locked On Bears. And in exchange, I'll always make sure to find time for you to bear down.